really seen exactly the same thing in the area of data protection. We've had literally dozens of measures that place obligations on states to exchange information with one another, dealing with every possible crime you can imagine, and also the creation of a number of EU-wide police databases, police and law enforcement databases. We've then finally had a proposed framework decision on data protection, which was ostensibly was supposed to ensure that standards of data protection, by which we mean data should be protected securely, data should only be exchanged if it's absolutely necessary, data should be destroyed after it's been used for the purpose for which it's been collected. So we've had this draft framework decision that was supposed to make sure all these principles that are long-established principles of EU law are implemented, and again it's just been watered down to the point that it's meaningless and is still yet to be adopted. More recently, the EU's decided that, well, we may have the principle of data protection, but we should now also introduce what it calls the principle of availability. Now, this basically means that any information held by any law enforcement agency in any member state should automatically be made available to any other member state upon request without further formality. Now, it seems to most reasoned people that this is actually the antithesis of privacy and data protection, but this is where we're going. I think it's a good example of kind of just principle agreed on the hoof, nodded through by ministers who don't really understand the full significance of the things that they're actually agreeing, and then it just gets passed to these technocrats and securocrats in obscure EU Council working parties, and before we know it, it's EU law. The issue of data retention is closely related to this. The EU, I think it was at the end of 2006, finally adopted a directive on what's called data retention. Now, this places an obligation on all communication service providers, that's telephony and internet, to retain their data for a minimum period of at least 6 months, but with an open-ended preservation period. And now I believe in Ireland that's been set at 5 years?
3 years.
3 years. So I think Italy has the highest amount, which maybe as far as 7 years. And basically, I mean, it was a fundamental decision in terms of civil liberties, the principle that you should effectively place the entire population under mandatory surveillance just in case the information that they produce becomes useful to the police at any point. It's worth pointing out that this is vastly different to the system in the US, where they did try to introduce some form of data retention. But what happens in the US is they have a system of preservation orders where if somebody is of interest to the police or security services, they go to a court, get what's called a preservation order, and the communication service provider then keeps data only on that person. In the EU, we now have mandatory data retention on everybody. As I understand it, the directive is about to be implemented here in Ireland by statutory order, so very little discussion or debate. This is exactly what happened in the UK last year. The UK was in fact pushing very hard for this data retention directive because it had already introduced a voluntary code on data retention. So a lot of the ISPs and the communications companies are doing this anyway, collecting this data, making it available to the police upon request. But the UK was seeking to make its voluntary code mandatory, so it went back to Brussels, said, we've got to have this data retention directive, or their whole counter-terrorism effort's going to fall apart. And effectively, railroaded it through the EU decision-making process. It's now been implemented in such a way in the UK, and again, I believe it's going to be the same here in Ireland, that the police no longer need a warrant from a court to access this data. All they need is an authorization from a senior officer. The interception of communications commissioner in his report of last year included figures on how the police are accessing this data for the first time, and over the first 12 months for which figures are available, police access communications data in the absence of a warrant 438,000 times. Now, given this is supposed to be, again, it's supposed to be dealing with serious crime, terrorism, organised crime, you're telling me they're accessing this kind of data over 1,000 times a day, and we shouldn't be worried. Okay, so mandatory data retention is really just one component of what people are now starting to call the surveillance society, and the EU has really been extremely influential in the construction of this so-called surveillance society. To mandatory data retention, we can add mandatory fingerprinting of all passport holders and all entrants to the EU. This has been agreed, though not yet implemented. We can also add the construction of massive population databases and the surveillance of all movement into, out of and across the EU. Is the European Union starting to resemble the Soviet Union?